The Hilton sale is on. Now through September 29th, you can save up to 20% on stays this fall and beyond. Long weekends, last-minute getaways, holiday gatherings. There's a Hilton stay for all of them. More moments, more experiences, more destinations. Now 20% off for a limited time because it matters where you stay. Don't wait. Book by September 29th and save up to 20% at Hilton.com. Terms apply. Hilton for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency. Make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. On this members-only episode, we'll be seeing Alexios grow exponentially as not only a military leader, but also as a fully developed personality within the Byzantine story of the 11th and 12th century. He will have his toughest challenge yet against an enemy as challenging and experienced as Roussel de Balliol, who begins this episode languishing in a Byzantine prison in the capital of Constantinople. We're continuing the mini-series called The Book of Alexios, and this is Patreon episode 21 entitled Chapter 2, Bryennios' Rebellion. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. The year 1074 saw a new hero emerge in Eastern Rome, 22-year-old Alexios Komnenos. It also saw this new hero, a man who was described by Anna Komnene, his daughter, in her epic biography, the Alexiad, as, quote, another Aemilius, a new Scipio, or a second Carthaginian Hannibal, end quote. Capture the dreaded Norman Roussel de Balliol through his wits alone. Anna declares, quote-unquote, nobody surpassed my father in ingenuity. The year 1074 also saw two impressive moves by Emperor Michael VII, securing the loyalties of both Hungary in the north and southern Normans in Italy, which subdued for a time the western edges of the empire. However, the Pope out west was also pushing Latin Christianity eastward by crowning a couple of kings, thus converting them to the Western Catholicism in the process. Both new kingdoms of Croatia and Dukla weren't so much anti-Eastern Rome, rather, they were just beginning to become their own entities and thus trying to shake off the vassalage they've long owed to Constantinople. Alexios enjoyed a year or two of growing fame and respect and influence across the empire. But he had to cut a fine line because a popular general was an ever-present threat and danger to any Roman emperor. But he was hardly the most powerful general or leader across the empire at the time. By 1076, the situation began to change once again. In the east, a one-time contender for the hand of Empress Eudokia, Michael VII's mother, a man who lost to the courageous and dashing Romanus IV Diogenes in the bid for the throne. His name was Nikephoros Botaneiates. Well, he was the governor of Rome and Anatolia. In the west, the governor of Illyrium, which contained the impressive port city of Durazzo, which in ancient times this city was called Dyrrhachium, actually had its own famous or infamous, depending on how you looked at it, battle many centuries earlier. Well, this governor of Illyrium was named Nikephoros Bryennios. In the middle, stationed in Constantinople when he wasn't moving his army around to put down small uprisings or Seljuk incursions, in the middle was young Alexios Komnenos, now about 26 years old. Across the empire, Michael VII's economic policies had dropped, in just 3 years, the gold content of the Byzantine numismata, their currency, from being in the 60% range to lower than 50% gold content. And that means that each coin contained less than 50% of the very metal that gave its value. This devaluation was crippling merchants in every village, town, and city, and it was simply unsustainable. In addition, the refugees from Anatolia, driven out by the Turkish invaders, were all huddling themselves in and around Constantinople, creating another unsustainable situation there. From food and water shortages to spiking crime rates, whether you feel sorry for refugees or not, or whether the refugees themselves are of a good heart or honorable or not, the age-old, time-tested reality of high refugee numbers in a short period of time inevitably leads to debilitating and sometimes deadly shortages and horrific increases in crime. It's inescapable. It's like I said, time-tested. And those residents who first welcome the refugees will, without question, eventually turn on those same refugees, causing tensions to rise and outbreaks of violence to emerge. The society itself doesn't have the time to adjust, and then throw on some horrible economic policies, and you have a bonfire in the 11th century Constantinople. The year 1076 saw all of this come to a head. Something had to give. Michael VII had to react, but he didn't have the funds to do so effectively. So, in an effort to raise the necessary funds, he implemented higher taxes across the board. But he increased the taxes on grains above all else, because grains were quite lucrative, to be honest. Within months, all across Greece, Thrace, Thessaloniki, and Illyrium, all political blocks out west, markets saw a marked decrease in the supply of grains. It wasn't because there was a poor harvest or invasions that burned the fields or kept the locals from harvesting the grains and wheat. No, it wasn't those things. Rather, word spread among farmers, believe it or not, back in the day, to withhold their supplies, only leaking small amounts into the Byzantine marketplaces. This shortage, this man-made shortage, further exacerbated what was happening in and around Constantinople, and the capital erupted in violence. In addition, Governor Nikephoros Bryennios, an accomplished and well-respected general in his own right, this is the governor way out in Illyrium, well, he claimed that there was strong evidence to show that within Michael VII's own palace advisors, Bryennios had been placed on a hit list of sorts. By early 1077, Nikephoros Bryennios had raised an army in the city of Durazzo in modern-day Albania. He declared himself emperor, and then he marched up to the western walls of Constantinople itself, all the way across the Balkans. However, something interesting happened upon his approach. Michael VII, fearing the worst, actually released Roussel de Balliol, the Norman, and his hundreds of knights. He bought their loyalty with lavish promises and sent them out across Thrace to battle Nikephoros Bryennios. Alexios Komnenos had a much larger army than Roussel did, but it was Roussel's forces, independent of Alexios's, that pestered and frustrated Bryennios to no end. Roussel, very quick, his army was very fast on the move. Roussel and his men actually won a number of smaller skirmishes against Bryennios, thus thinning the pretender's forces little by little. So by the time Bryennios reached the outskirts of Constantinople, he and his warriors, well, they were quite rattled. However, in addition to Bryennios, another man had had enough of Michael VII's leadership. As far as he was concerned, Michael VII had failed and was pile-driving the empire into oblivion, all things considered. His name was another Nikephoros, Nikephoros Botaneiates, and in 1077 he was turning 75 years old and felt that it was, at last, time to act. He too raised an army, this one from central and western Anatolia, including Seljuk mercenaries under the leadership of the newly appointed Sultan of Rum named Suleiman, and various Norman leftovers from the overthrow of Roussel de Balliol who were still, milling about the region and beginning to settle down with families of their own. Yes, if you can believe it, central Turkey today still hosts descendants of these very Norman soldiers. Here we have a new chessboard forming. Bryennios from the west and Botaneiates from the southeast. Both Nikephoroses, by the way, both converging onto a Constantinople guarded by none other than Alexios Komnenos. And as always, at the heart of all of this were the people who were starving in the streets of every major city, no more so than Constantinople itself. The famine even reached the wealthier merchant class as they had nothing to sell. Therefore, they had no income with which to buy food for themselves or even, pay workers. By the time the two pretenders, the two Nikephoroses, Bryennios and Botaneiates, reached the capital, Michael VII had to employ some pretty horrible measures to put down the citywide unrest. John Carr, in his book, The Komneni Dynasty, writes, quote, "The people of Constantinople were seething with economic discontent," end quote. And he continues from the perspective of Bryennios and Botaneiates waiting hungrily in the wings to pounce, saying, quote, "And both were happy to wait for the discontent to erupt in mass violence," end quote. And it did erupt in what is now called the Bread Riots of 1078. Now, the Bread Riots of 1078 saw violence in Constantinople unheard of for centuries. This magnificent city, a city that still held literal legend status to the Vikings in the far north, was normally stuffed with 500,000 residents. That's 500,000 people. However, since Manzikert a handful of years earlier, it swelled, and I mean swelled, with tens of thousands more people, refugees of the carnage and loss out east. Carr tells us that government buildings were burnt to ash. Government officials, such as the eunuch mentioned before, Nikephoritses, the man who had replaced Michael Psellos, he was captured by the lay people, tortured, and then killed unceremoniously by the mobs of dissidents. The streets ran red with the blood of laymen, rioters, and defenders alike. Mothers held their young children as they gasped their last breaths from malnourishment and illness. Disease wreaked havoc from overpopulation and polluted water sources. Leadership was thinned out through horrific treatment, self-exile, and assassination. The term bread riots seems a bit of a punchline, kind of trite, but it was far from a throwaway event, far from a minor occurrence with little lasting effect. It fundamentally changed the relationship that the populace had with its leaders, and it had such an impact as to convince Michael VII that his time was indeed up. With very little prompting, Michael VII, much more comfortable in the cloister than the halls of power, decided on his own that someone else, anyone else, could have the crown. Michael VII Ducas abdicated willingly and walked himself into the monastery at Studion, as Anna says, quote, "exchanging the diadem and cloak of an emperor for the alb and tunic of a high priest," end quote. During these riots around the greatest city on the planet, quietly, unmourned, as Carr says, and easily overlooked, the great chronicler, philosopher, teacher, and imperial power broker for decades passed away. His name was Michael Psellos. Alexios Komnenos needed to pick a side now that he was without an emperor, so he chose the older, wiser, and much more respected Nikephoros Botaneiates, again the governor of Anatolia, who was encamped just south across the Bosporus, waiting for such a moment to march into the capital. Nikephoros Bryennios, in Adrianople, waiting for his own chance to march into the city, heard the news that Alexios had chosen Botaneiates, and he left and took his army out west to continue to increase his own support while declaring himself emperor. Botaneiates, in the meantime, was led straight to the Hagia Sophia and proclaimed officially Emperor Nikephoros III by the patriarch there. He immediately negotiated a marriage with Michael VII's now ex-wife, Maria, a princess of the Kingdom of Georgia, remember. Writing later, Anna Komnene, again, the daughter of Alexios Komnenos, who wouldn't be born for another 5 years from this time, knew Empress Maria quite well from her childhood. She described Maria like this, quote, "She was in fact very tall, like a cypress tree. Her skin was snow white, her face was oval, her complexion wholly reminiscent of a spring flower or a rose. As for the flash of her eyes, what mortal could describe it? Eyebrows, flame-colored, arched above eyes of light blue. A painter's hand has many times reproduced the colors of all the flowers brought to birth, each in its own season. But the beauty of the empress, the grace that shone about her, the charming attractiveness of her ways, these seemed to baffle description, to be beyond the artist's skill. The Gorgon's head, so they say, turned men into stone. But a man who saw the empress walking, or who suddenly met her, would be stupefied, rooted to the spot, and rendered speechless, apparently deprived in that one moment of all feeling and reason. Such was the proportion and perfect symmetry of her body, each part in harmony, that no one till then had ever seen its like among humankind. A living work of art, an object of desire to lovers of beauty. She was indeed love incarnate, visiting, as it were, this earthly world." End quote. So basically, this Maria of Georgia, this Empress Maria to the former Emperor Michael VII Dukas, and new empress to the 76-year-old Emperor Nikephoros III Botaneiates, basically, even Anna Komnene would say that she was a stone-cold hottie. Anna Komnene spoke very highly of her own mother and her own grandmother, but never quite in terms such as these. Keep this in mind going forward. By all accounts, Maria was a catch. So, to recap, Eastern Rome was now led by Nikephoros III Botaneiates and his wife, Empress Maria of Georgia. The mighty Alexios Komnenos was loyally awaiting his emperor's orders to deal with the self-proclaimed emperor, Nikephoros Bryennios, way out west in Illyrium. Now, Anna writes, quote, "Bryennios was a mighty warrior, one of the most extraordinary men, tall, of noble lineage, very handsome, dignified and thoughtful, physically strong, an outstanding candidate for the imperial throne in that generation. So persuasive were his arguments, and so great his ability to influence all men, even at first sight and the beginning of their acquaintance, that everyone, both soldiers and civilians, united in giving him precedence and judging him worthy to rule over the whole empire, east and west." End quote. In her own words, having thrown the empire into anxiety, quote, "It was my father, therefore, Alexios Komnenos, whom they decided to pit against Bryennios." End quote. The problem was that Alexios had nothing to work with in terms of manpower and resources. We already know the empire that Nikephoros III had inherited. So Alexios scrounged up what he could, which was a meager force to say the least, which consisted of a smattering of Franks, Romans, Pechenegs, and Seljuks. And even their most elite units were still very young and had very little experience, if any, for some of them, as they just recently joined. With this, though, Alexios marched west to meet Bryennios and bring his growing rebellion to a swift conclusion. And let me just insert one side note here. It's a goodbye of sorts. Roussel de Balliol, at this point right here in the records, will just simply drift away. We have no clue what happened to him. After fighting and doing those skirmishes and being quite effective against Bryennios' first approach on Constantinople, he disappears from the records. We don't know if he was killed in skirmishing. We wonder if that would have made it into the records, first of all. But he just simply disappears. So we will not see Roussel de Balliol ever again. Now, while Alexios marched, back in the capital, Nikephoros III had only just quelled the majority of the Bread Riots, though fires still burned uncontrollably, and looking out from his palace on the far eastern edges of the city, columns of black smoke surely informed the new emperor that his city was far from being at peace once again. Whole neighborhoods were smoldering in ash. The canals crisscrossing the city were festering with disease-ridden bacteria feeding off loads of bloated, swollen corpses, and sporadic outbursts of fighting still pockmarked the great city. But business had to be attended to. Decisions had to be made. The job of an emperor was never finished, 24 hours a day. Skyrocketing inflation, plummeting devaluation of the numismata, and existing alliances with various folks in and around the empire needed addressed as quickly as possible. Marrying the ex-empress may have helped to bridge the gap in public trust, as Maria was once married to Michael VII Dukas, making her, if you squint just so at this point, making her a member still of the Dukas family. And now the 76-year-old Botaneiates was also able to claim such a connection to the mighty Dukas house. Remember, with the capture of Roussel de Balliol a few years earlier, the powerful John Dukas, having given up the claim of emperor when he was returned to his nephew Michael's court, was still prowling the halls of power in the capital. Accentuating this connection was key for Nikephoros III, and one of the key parts of his marriage with Maria was that her son, with the previous emperor, the boy named Constantine Dukas, would inherit the throne upon Nikephoros' death. This went a really long way to subduing any Dukas threats on the horizon, and the people were happy that there was a firm succession in place. In addition to his first moves of marriage and naming a successor, Nikephoros III also sought to add a little stability to court politics by decreeing that any and all political prisoners may have their eyes taken out, but they are not to be executed within 30 days of the blinding. This ensures that cooler heads may prevail and the person may live. He hoped that this would show any potential usurper of his generosity and mercy as a ruler, thus keeping them from doing anything rash themselves. And finally, in those first few days as emperor, Nikephoros III was forced to raise taxes once again, and well, this never bodes well for any ruler. Now consider the decade this particular empire has had, and you can just imagine how the people took the news. Nikephoros III had no choice but to unleash his own retaliatory response. He bought their love. He lavished the capital with games and food and gifts and building projects, which, let's be honest, were really just repairs from the recent destruction of the city. How was he going to pay for it all, you ask? Well, by raising taxes even higher, of course. It drained the already drained coffers, and this sent the population into another violent frenzy because inflation and scarcity of resources and food rose even higher than it already was. By the way, the city still had tens of thousands of extra refugees in it. Nikephoros III Botaneiates was, within a month, shaping up to be no better than any other emperor they've had since Basil II, save for one, Isaac I Komnenos.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
When your investors, customers, and workers demand more from your business, make it happen with SAP. The AI-powered capabilities of SAP can help you streamline costs, connect with new suppliers, and manage payroll, even when your business is being pulled in different directions. To deliver a quality product at a fair price while paying your people what they're worth too, so your business can stay unfazed. Learn more at sap.com/uncertainty.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As for Alexios, by the time Nikephoros III was dealing with another swell in rebellion inside the capital, the young general reached Thrace and began to survey the situation. Following the Via Egnatia, the main road built by Romans a millennium earlier to facilitate safe travel between west and east, the road connecting Constantinople in the east to Durazzo in the west, he had learned that Bryennios was indeed quite influential and respected out there, but not entirely. There was hope the closer he stayed to Constantinople. Hearing word that Bryennios was marching from Durazzo to engage him, Alexios decided to camp along the Helmirus River at a place called Calora. Sending for reinforcements, he began thinking of alternatives to an outright assault against the pretender. Bryennios' force, from his scouts, he learned, was larger than his and filled with more experienced soldiers. Anna writes, quote-unquote, "For to attack Bryennios head-on was impossible. Thus he planned a victory by stealth." Word soon came that Bryennios had encamped his forces on a wide plain called Kidoktos. Time was running out for Alexios. Anna basically stated that all things equal, quote, "The task at hand is to see how fortune favored one side," end quote. Alexios would lead it up to a spin of the wheel, you could say. Now, finding out where Alexios was camped, Bryennios formed up his battle lines and marched toward the one person standing in his way of marching on the capital. Again, by this time, we have no idea what happened to Roussel de Balliol. Nikephoros Bryennios held the center with thousands of Macedonians and Thracians, while his brother, John Bryennios, yes, another brother named John, commanded 5,000 Normans, Lombards, and Thessalonian horse warriors. And Anna writes, quote-unquote, "members of the detachment of the famous Maniakes," on the right. Now, on the left, another group of Macedonians and Thracians were commanded by a name named Tarcheniates Katakalon. The army looked sharp, apparently, because Anna relates Nikephoros Bryennios riding around them like the god Ares, or a giant, quote-unquote, standing out head and shoulders above all others, taller by a cubit, was in truth an object of wonder and dread to those who saw him. And waiting in ambush for Bryennios were some well-paid Cumans that were ordered to descend on Alexios' rear as soon as battle commenced. These Cumans were to keep their distance and merely harass the enemy with thunderclouds of arrows. As for Alexios, he had been encamped there at least a week longer than Bryennios, so he had a much better survey of the land, of the battlefield. In addition, he had sent scouts to hide in the surrounding hills and ravines to watch the approach and the subsequent movements and organization of Bryennios' forces. They reported back a string of valuable information. Alexios knew that the Cuman horse archers were hiding in the hills to his right flank, so he ordered a couple of units to hide in the ravines to his left flank. These men would have similar orders as the Cumans had, but Alexios ordered them to engage in close hand-to-hand combat to Bryennios' rear when they heard the order ring out. As it was, Bryennios' army was upwards of 12,000 men, while Alexios had around, as low as 7,000. though some estimates bring it closer to 10. Either way, Alexios was outnumbered and up against a far more experienced army, including its respected leader, again, Nikephoros Bryennios. Marching out of the nearby fortified town of Kalivriae, Alexios, by this time, knew the wooded hills on either side of the battlefield pretty well. He was confident in the plan. At the last second, some Seljuk scouts were captured by the Cumans waiting in the wings, and Bryennios was able to learn of the actual size of Alexios' army, a well-guarded secret up to this point. Clearly having the superior numbers, Bryennios ordered the army to march at young Alexios, who knew about this from a few survivors of that same Seljuk scouting unit who made it back and gave him a heads up. Things were off to an absolutely horrible start for Alexios. Quickly reorganizing, he kept his units in the ravine on his enemy's right flank in place. That part of the plan would remain the same, and so as to get the orders to them as quickly as possible, Alexios did something a bit unorthodox in medieval and ancient warfare, and he himself lined up closest to these units in the ravine. That is, he lined up not in the center, but on the left flank. He led there on the left flank his contingent of elite troops known as the Chaminitoi, or Immortals. On the right flank, led by Constantine Katakalon, kinsman of Bryennios' Tarcheniates Katakalon, across the way, he matched Seljuk archers and horse warriors with the hidden Cumans, trying to surprise Bryennios using fire with fire. And in the center were a large contingent of Frankish mercenaries, both on foot and horseback, their gleaming armor matching the Normans among Bryennios' men. At the last minute, Alexios ordered part of Constantine Katakalon's Turkish right flank to break off and hide in the hills as well. So when the Cumans attacked, not only would they be meeting Seljuk archers on the battlefield proper, but they would be enclosed from behind by more fast-moving Seljuks. Alexios knew this was not a battle of attrition. This was a battle of wits. He simply didn't have the numbers for attrition, but he did have the brains. When Bryennios ordered the march toward Alexios did the same. The two armies clashed with thunderous noise, all three flanks smashing into their opposites simultaneously. The echoes between the hills must have been deafening in those first few minutes of fighting. Alexios called out the order for units lying in wait in the nearby ravine to spring forward and attack John Bryennios' flank, while he himself ordered his Immortals smashing into John Bryennios' front, overwhelming the pretender's brother almost immediately. It was very, very simple, but it was incalculably effective. Nikephoros Bryennios in the center saw what happened, but only when he noticed men on the right flank, his right flank, and men to his own contingent's right fleeing the battlefield. Anna writes, quote, "At this point, one of Alexios' Immortals, a hot-headed, reckless fellow, spurred on his horse in front of the rest and slackening rein charged straight for Bryennios. He thrust his spear very hard at Bryennios' chest, but he, drawing his sword quickly before it could strike home, hitting his attacker in the collarbone and hacking down with all his might, severed his whole arm, tearing straight through the breastplate." End quote. Bryennios immediately turned and screamed at his men, fleeing the battlefield to rejoin, and they did. Alexios ordered the Turks on his right flank to shower arrows over toward Bryennios' center, which they did, and the center became overwhelmed with not only arrows, but also the armored Frankish knights, who weren't too fazed by the shower of missiles raining down upon them. Over on the right, the Seljuks hiding in wait suddenly charged at the Cumans, who had moved forward to join the battle. But the Cumans bypassed them and fell into Alexios' right flank with devastating effect. Simultaneously, the arrows from Alexios' right flank let up on Bryennios' center because they now had these newcomers to the field to contend with. And Bryennios ordered a massive push forward, using his numbers to his advantage. Alexios' left flank and center were now moving backward, not the direction anyone wants to be going in a pitched battle. Because of this change of fortune, Bryennios was able to, right there, in the midst of heated battle, he was able to convince the Frenchmen in Alexios' center to actually switch allegiances. This amounted to hundreds and hundreds of armored French warriors now fighting for Bryennios. It was a massive blow to Alexios' forces and ambitions. The battlefield became almost unrecognizable to how it began. Battle lines were thrown into the air, some people fleeing on both sides, warriors switching from one leader to the other. It was absolute chaos. And in this chaos, Alexios grabbed a handful of his closest men and charged on horseback directly at Nikephoros Bryennios, currently giving orders to his new French allies. This proved to rally many of Alexios' men back into the fray. The Cumans on Bryennios' left flank saw the tides ebbing and flowing, and not wishing to take any chances, the Cumans fled en masse back to Bryennios' camp, cleared the area of all valuables and food, and then they literally fled back home. They left the battlefield altogether. Word quickly reached Bryennios' men, and morale plummeted. Chronicler Michael Ateliates recounts how, in that moment, he spotted Bryennios atop his horse and charged at him. That is, Alexios spotted Bryennios atop his horse and charged at him. Quote, Alexios, with great bravery and cunning, managed to unseat Bryennios from his horse and quickly mounted it himself, causing confusion and fear among Bryennios' troops who saw their leader dismounted. End quote. He goes on to explain, this Ateliates, that Bryennios and Alexios were separated in the battle, but Alexios cut down the two men, holding the reins of Bryennios' horse, fully clad in imperial purple, and stole the horse itself. Riding the horse back to his camp across the river from Calivre, the battlefield was proclaimed Nikephoros Bryennios', and the pretender's forces hailed him as the victor, him as the emperor. Even the rear guard, who had fled the camp when it was recently overrun by the opportunistic Cumans, joined Bryennios, and they celebrated, though news of the camp was still a big blow to Bryennios himself, no doubt. Back in his camp, riding atop Bryennios' horse, rumor spread that Bryennios was dead. Well, why else would Alexios be riding the pretender's horse? Alexios let the rumor fester for a few minutes before calling these deserters back to the battlefield with him. Just in time for a regroup and attack, a brand new band of Seljuk warriors rode into view and joined Alexios as the counterattack commenced. It was perfect timing. Alexios pushed 2 units of Turkish horsemen on both flanks this time, and then reorganized his much smaller force into 2 lines, one in front and one in back. Atop Bryennios' steed, still all clad in purple, Alexios marched his army back onto the field of battle where Bryennios' army was celebrating, having assumed it was all finished, and they had already let down their guards. Coming into view, Bryennios immediately ordered his army back into its lines and steadied each man as the enemy approached quickly. But this time, unbeknownst to anyone in Bryennios' camp, Alexios had no intention of engaging in another pitched battle. He was pulling out a page from the general's playbook reaching as far back in history as Alexander the Great. It was a page entitled The Feigned Retreat. Sending out horse archers ahead of him, riding close enough to shower arrows on Bryennios' men before pulling back and circling back around again a few times, doing the same, Alexios slowly marched up behind him. When these Turks became exhausted of arrows, Alexios surprised everyone by sending in heavy cavalry units directly at Bryennios' center. Causing absolute confusion and devastation to Bryennios' center, Alexios called for an immediate retreat. The heavy cavalry and Seljuk horsemen followed the orders, and they all fell back. Bryennios ordered his men to chase them toward the river, hoping to trap Alexios' forces between his army and the river. The game would be all but won at that point. But at the last second, Alexios ordered an about-face and charged back at Bryennios' stunned army. In addition to this, Alexios ordered those Seljuk archers who were hiding in wait in the wooded hills in ambush on either side to descend upon Bryennios' flanks as he did earlier. He ordered them forward. Remember, these were the new reinforcements that arrived just in time for Alexios' second charge. They had fresh arrows and fresh energy, and they blasted the sides of Bryennios' army with a fury not seen since the outset of the battle a couple hours earlier. By this time, all but these particular Seljuk ambushers were absolutely exhausted. They were bushed from all the fighting, which had lasted, again, a couple hours already. This was enough to turn the tide. Bryennios' army collapsed. The pretender emperor was captured, but not without one hell of a fight. Bryennios had received a new horse by this time and had ridden it into this particular phase of the battle. Anna writes, quote, "But when his horse grew weary, unable to either flee or even pursue, it was almost at its last gasp through constant chargings. Bryennios reined it in and, like some courageous athlete, stood ready for combat, challenging two brave Turks to fight. One struck at him with his spear, but was not fast enough to give a heavy blow. Instead, he received a heavier one from Bryennios' right arm, which, too quick for him, cut off his hand with his sword, and hand and spear together rolled to the ground. The other Turk leapt down from his horse, and like a panther, jumped onto Bryennios' mount, gripping tight into its side, and there he clung desperately, trying to climb onto its back. Like a wild beast, Bryennios kept twisting round and tried to stab him off with his sword, but without success, for the Turk behind him kept swaying to avoid the blows. Eventually, his right arm, tired of striking at thin air and himself worn out with fighting, Bryennios surrendered to the main body of the army. They seized him like men who have won great glory, took him off to Alexios Komnenos. The latter was standing not far away from the place where Bryennios was taken, and was at the time marshaling the barbarian troops in his force as well as his own men, encouraging them to fight." End quote. Now, after the battle fell apart and Alexios Komnenos was declared the official winner, Alexios met Nikephoros Bryennios, now in chains and stripped of his imperial purple, in his tent. They chatted for quite some time, two warriors after a respected battle, and in true Alexios form, Alexios chose not to punish this proud Roman general. Even Anna admits as much when she says, quote, "It was contrary to Komnenos' nature to inflict injury on those who had fought against him, once they were captured. He thought capture was punishment enough for an enemy. He treated them humanely, with kindness, with generosity. This was certainly the case with Bryennios." End quote. Anna even recounts a story of their journey back to Constantinople together when they stopped the army to rest. The two men, Alexios and Nikephoros Bryennios, the two men walked to the top of a nearby hill to eat, chat, and rest under what Anna calls, quote-unquote, a high-leafed oak. By this time, Alexios had even taken the chains off of Bryennios as a show of respect and peace. Alexios closed his eyes eventually and drifted off to sleep in the midday shade of the giant oak tree. Bryennios was left alone with Alexios, and it's said that in that moment, Bryennios was overwhelmed with the urge to pull Alexios' sword from its sheath and strike Alexios dead. But something, maybe God, maybe honor, kept him from doing so. Alexios kept Bryennios safe, and when they reached Adrianople, news awaited the victorious general from Emperor Nikephoros III himself. Victorious generals were popular generals, and popular generals, as we've said, well, they were a threat. They had a well-established history of executing a coup against the emperor. Nikephoros III, old man, very wise, knew his history, forbade Alexios Komnenos from getting any closer to the capital in that moment, especially since he enjoyed so much popularity there already, and the city was still smoldering. Alexios ordered Nikephoros Bryennios to be delivered to the emperor without delay, and that he not be harmed at any moment. Alexios had new orders, which we will get to in time, but following Bryennios' story, we find that Nikephoros III didn't have quite the same respect for his enemies as Alexios had. A non-native Roman who worked quite closely to Emperor Nikephoros III, named Bryennios, took Bryennios from Alexios. Bryennios was no fan of Alexios' rising star, and driven by jealousy for the young general and the growing admiration for him by the emperor, Bryennios spitefully defied Alexios' wishes and protections. Bryennios was promptly blinded and sent back to Adrianople to live out his days without hope of ever leading another rebellion again. And thus ended the rebellion of Nikephoros Bryennios of 1078, a man who almost walked straight into Constantinople as a savior, but was stopped by a 28-year-old general named Alexios Komnenos. On the next episode, we see Alexios take on the next challenger to the Byzantine crown, a seemingly never-ending cycle of usurpers that just kept producing one potential threat after another. As always, thank you for your support. Until next time.